I am 71 years old. I have spent the last 30 years hiding a secret that destroyed my career, my marriage, and my family. And I would do it all again, every single time. Because in October of 1995, the United States military cornered a wounded mother Bigfoot in a rain-soaked canyon in the Cascade Range. They gave the order to fire, and I was the only soldier who said no. What happened next cost me everything I thought mattered, but it gave me something I never expected, something that would last nearly 3 decades, something that started with a creature's eyes finding mine through the rain and ended with a touch so gentle it still wakes me up at night. My name is Thomas Edward Rains. I was a staff sergeant in the United States Army for 14 years. I earned a commendation for valor. I completed 2 overseas deployments. And right now, under my bed, next to that commendation, there is a shoebox. Inside that shoebox is a lock of coarse, reddish-brown hair that no laboratory on Earth would be able to classify. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before you can understand what happened in that canyon, you need to understand the man I was before I walked into it. Fort Lewis, Washington, summer of 1995. I was 41 years old, married 11 years to a woman named Karen who taught 3rd grade in Lakewood. We had a daughter named Lily. She was 9. I was the kind of soldier who polished his boots on Sunday nights. Hospital corners on every fold. I believed in the chain of command the way some men believe in God. I did not question orders. I did not second-guess my superiors. I followed procedure because procedure kept men alive. I had seen what happened when men decided they knew better than the system. But here is something most people never think about. What happens when the system decides it knows better than your conscience? What happens when following orders means crossing a line you did not know existed until you were standing right on top of it? In July of 1995, I found out. My unit was reassigned. 17 soldiers pulled into a windowless room on the 2nd floor of a building I had never been inside before. Our commanding officer was Colonel David Mercer. He briefed us on a classified operation, a wildlife containment mission in the Cascade Range, coordinated with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and elements of the Department of the Interior. He told us we would be locating, tranquilizing, and transporting specimens of a large, unidentified primate species that had been observed in the area over 18 months. He called them the subjects. He said it with the same flat tone he used for supply requisitions. He did not say Bigfoot. He did not say Sasquatch. Corporal Danny Vega leaned over and whispered, "Sarge, are they serious?" I told him to keep his mouth shut and follow orders. That was who I was, a man who trusted the machine he was part of, a man who never once considered that the machine could be wrong. 6 weeks of training followed, and every single day of it should have told me something was wrong. Land navigation exercises in the Olympic National Forest. Fine, standard, but the tranquilizer systems were not standard. Large-bore pneumatic rifles that fired darts the size of my index finger. The sedative compound inside them had no label, no paperwork, no manufacturer's stamp. When Specialist Torres asked what was in the darts, the civilian advisor just said, "It'll put down anything up to 1,200 pounds. Torres asked what happened above 1,200 pounds. The advisor did not answer. The thermal imaging equipment was 2 generations ahead of anything I had used in the field. Military-grade gear that had no business being issued for a wildlife operation. And the non-disclosure agreements, 11 pages long, referencing federal statutes I had never heard of. One clause stated that unauthorized disclosure would be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act, for a wildlife containment mission. I remember holding the pen over that page and feeling a flicker of something in my gut. Not doubt. I did not allow myself doubt in those days. Just a flicker. I signed it. I signed every page. I did not ask a single question. That is who I was, a man who believed the system so completely that he could hold evidence of something deeply wrong in his hands and choose not to see it. Karen noticed something was different. She said I was quieter than usual. For me, that was saying something. I came home from training and sat on the back porch and stared at the tree line behind our housing unit for 45 minutes without moving. Lily came outside and asked me to play catch. I looked at her, and for a moment I did not recognize my own daughter. That is what classified operations do to you. They build a wall inside your mind, and everything on the other side of it starts to feel less real. Karen looked at me the way she sometimes did when she knew I was holding something back. She said, "Tom, just promise me you'll come home." I promised. It was the last promise I made to her that I was able to keep. But what Karen did not know, what none of us knew, was that by the time I came home, the man she married would already be gone. The question is, when exactly did I start to change? Was it in the canyon? Was it the moment I stepped in front of those rifles? Or was it earlier? Was it the first time I looked into those eyes and understood that the world was bigger and stranger and more beautiful than anything the Army had trained me to see? September 29th, 1995. We deployed. 17 soldiers. 3 civilian advisors, whose names I was never given. Colonel Mercer. Helicopters dropped us into a narrow valley, approximately 40 miles east of Mount Rainier. The forward operating base was small. 4 semi-permanent structures. A communications tent. A landing zone carved out of the timber. It rained the day we arrived. It did not stop raining for 16 days. The valley was dense with old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, the forest floor existed in permanent twilight. But there was something else, something in the air that first night, a smell, faint, musky, carried on the wind from deeper in the valley. Private first class. Maria Santos said it smelled like a wet dog mixed with something fermented. She was close. But she was not right. It was something older, something that did not fit into any category I had for living things. And it made the hair on my arm stand up in a way I had not felt since my first deployment overseas. The first week was reconnaissance. 4-man teams mapping the valley, cataloging signs of large animal activity. What we found should have been impossible. Footprints in the mud measuring 19 inches long and 8 inches wide. Stride length of nearly 5 feet. Trees with bark stripped at heights of 8 to 10 feet. The exposed wood gouged with parallel scratches too wide and too deep to be bare. Scat containing plant material, berries, and processed bone fragments, and crude shelters, bent saplings, layered branches, constructed with a deliberateness that suggested planning, not instinct, planning. I documented everything in a field notebook I still have. The entries from that first week are clinical, precise. The observations of a trained soldier. The entries from the second week are different. The handwriting gets worse. The observations become personal. Because in the second week, we saw one. And nothing I had been trained for prepared me for what I felt. October 8th, 1995. Approximately 0630 hours. I was leading a 4-man team on a sweep of the eastern ridge. Specialist Torres was on point. He raised a fist, dropped to one knee. I moved up beside him and followed his line of sight into a shallow ravine choked with ferns and fallen timber, a shape near the stream. Large, dark, hunched. I thought it was a bear. Bears I understood. Bears fit the categories my training had built inside my mind. Then it stood up. I have replayed that moment 10,000 times in 30 years. It still makes my chest tighten. It stood up the way a person stands up, not the lumbering rise of a bear on its hind legs. A human motion, straightening at the waist, rising to full height with a fluidity that was both graceful and terrifying. 7.5 feet, maybe more. Its body was covered in dark brown hair that turned almost black when wet, with a reddish tint along the shoulders and forearms that caught the dim morning light. The shoulders were broader than any human I had ever seen, wider than a defensive lineman, wider than anything my brain had a frame of reference for. The arm hung longer in proportion than seemed anatomically possible, the fingertips reaching past the knees. Then it turned toward us, and everything I thought I knew about the world broke apart in about 3 seconds. The face was not human, but it was not animal either. Heavy brow ridge casting deep shadows over the eye sockets, wide, flat nose, massive jaw with a mouth that looked capable of expressions I was not prepared to see. But the eyes were brown, deep, rich brown, and they were intelligent in a way that no amount of training could have prepared me for. Not the flat awareness of a predator assessing prey, not the blank stare of livestock. These were eyes that held thought behind them, memory, understanding. And they looked at us with an expression I can only describe as weary recognition, not surprise. It was not surprised to see humans with weapons in its forest, not fear. It did not flinch or startle. It looked at us the way you look at something you have been expecting and dreading in equal measure. Like a man who hears the knock on the door and already knows who is on the other side. It was holding a fish in its left hand, half eaten, scales glinting. It had been eating breakfast. The sheer mundanity of that detail almost broke me. A creature that was not supposed to exist, eating breakfast by a stream, interrupted by men with guns. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably 12 seconds. 12 seconds that rewrote the operating system of my brain. Then it turned and walked into the timber without hurry, without panic, carrying its fish, stepping over a fallen log with the easy grace of something that had walked this forest for longer than I had been alive. And it vanished. Torres looked at me. His face was the color of old paper. He said, "Sarge, what the hell was that?" I told him it was the subject. I told him to mark the coordinates. I told him to follow procedure, but my hands were shaking so badly I had to try 3 times to key the radio. Within 2 hours, our entire unit was deployed to the eastern ridge. Mercer was electric. He kept saying, "This is it, this is it," and the way he said it made me uneasy. It did not sound like a commander managing an operation. It sounded like obsession. And here is something I wish I had understood sooner. When the person giving orders cares more about the prize than the cost, everyone under his command is in danger. Over the next 4 days, we tracked the creatures through the valley. We found evidence of at least 4 individuals, 2 large adults, 1 medium-sized, and 1 whose prints measured only 11 inches, a juvenile. The civilian advisors confirmed what I had begun to suspect. We were not tracking a lone animal. We were tracking a family. And what do families do when they sense a predator closing in? They protect their most vulnerable. Remember that. Because what came next depended on it entirely. October 12th. Mercer ordered a containment maneuver. The plan was to use noisemakers and smoke to drive the group into a narrow box canyon at the valley's southern end. Block the exit. Move in with tranquilizers. Clean. Efficient. On paper. In practice, it was chaos. The creatures were faster than we anticipated, far more intelligent. They recognized the trap almost immediately. The two large adults split in different directions, drawing our teams apart. The medium-sized individual vanished entirely. But the smaller prints kept moving toward the canyon, and they were accompanied by a single set of large adult prints, slightly narrower, spaced closer together. The civilian advisors said it was a female, a mother, staying with her young one while the others drew the danger away. I recognized that tactic. I had seen it in human combat, sacrifice, calculated and deliberate, and it told me more about what we were dealing with than any briefing ever had. But here's the part that still keeps me up at night. We knew it was a mother with her child. We knew. And Mercer pushed forward anyway. They reached the box canyon at approximately 1400 hours, rain coming in sheets, temperature in the low 40s. I was positioned on the eastern wall with Torres and two others, looking down into a narrow space maybe 200 feet long and 60 feet wide, walled on three sides by sheer rock. And there she was, crouched against the far wall, hurt. I could see it through my binoculars. She was favoring her left side, a dark patch on her lower torso that was not fur. One of the smoke canisters had malfunctioned during the herding operation. Instead of producing low-grade irritant smoke, it had detonated with enough force to send shrapnel into the surrounding area. The shrapnel had found her. She was pressed against the rock wall, and she was holding something behind her with her right arm. The juvenile. I could not see it clearly. Her body was blocking it, shielding it with everything she had. She looked up at us, at the soldiers lining the rim, and her expression was not rage. It was not the mindless terror of a cornered animal. It was pleading. She was looking at us and asking us not to do this. Have you ever seen something that large look that helpless? Have you ever watched a mother try to make herself a wall between her child and a threat she knows she cannot stop? I have, and I will see it every day for the rest of my life. Colonel Mercer arrived at my position at 1430 hours. He assessed the situation through binoculars and ordered the tranquilizer teams to the rim. I asked about the injury. I said the subject appeared wounded and asked if we should adjust the dosage. He looked at me like I had spoken another language. He said the sedative protocol was calibrated for maximum body weight. No field adjustments. I asked about the juvenile. I said the adult dosage could kill a juvenile. He said the juvenile was a secondary objective. The primary target was the adult female. He said the word target, and something inside me shifted. Something I did not know could move. I had followed orders my entire career. I had trusted the chain of command like gospel. But standing on that rim in the rain, looking down at a wounded mother protecting her child from men with guns, I felt the foundation of everything I believed begin to crack. And the cracks did not stop. Mercer gave the order to fire. 3 tranquilizer teams shouldered their rifles and took aim. I was not on a tranquilizer team. My job was to maintain the perimeter. My job was to stand there and watch. And I could not do it. I stepped forward. I put myself between the nearest team and their line of fire. I said, loudly enough for Mercer to hear, "Sir, I am requesting that we stand down and reassess. The subject is injured. The juvenile is at risk. This is not a clean operation." the canyon went silent. Only the rain continued. Mercer walked toward me. His face was rigid with a fury I had seen only once before. He said, "Staff Sergeant Rains, you will stand down immediately, or I will have you arrested and court-martialed." I looked at him. Then I looked down into the canyon, and she was looking at me, the mother, through the rain. She had turned toward the sound of our voices, and her eyes had found mine. Not Mercer's, not the rifleman's, mine. As if she understood that the argument on the rim was about her. And in that moment, something passed between us that I have never been able to put into words. Recognition. Not of species, not of language, not of rank. Recognition of one being looking at another and understanding that what happens next defines who you are for the rest of your life. I said, "Sir, I will not stand down. I am formally protesting this action under Article 138. 3 seconds of silence. Then Mercer turned to Corporal Vega and said, "Remove Staff Sergeant Rains from the perimeter. Restrain him. Trank teams. Fire on my command." Vega put his hand on my arm. I did not resist. I was still a soldier. I had made my protest. The system would hear it or it would not. But as Vega pulled me back, something stopped, both of us dead. A sound, from below, from the canyon, not the mother. It started low, subsonic. A vibration I felt in my sternum before I heard it with my ears. It built in volume and pitch until it became a vocalization unlike anything I had ever heard. Deep, resonant, echoing off the canyon walls, coming from everywhere at once. 8 seconds. Then silence. Absolute silence. Even the rain seemed to pause. Then the forest answered. From the north, from the eastern ridge, from somewhere behind our base. The call was returned, not once, not twice, at least 6 distinct voices, each one deep and powerful, each one coming from a different direction. The civilian advisors went pale. Torres crossed himself. Mercer grabbed his radio and started barking orders, but I heard the crack in his voice. We were not the hunters anymore. We had cornered a mother and her child, and the rest of the family was coming. What does a military unit do when it realizes it is no longer the apex predator in the valley? What happens when the thing you thought you were hunting decides to remind you what it is capable of? What happened over the next 40 minutes is still classified. I gave my word on that, and my word still means something. What I will say is this: Mercer ordered an emergency withdrawal. The tranquilizer teams never fired. We pulled back to the base in a retreat that felt nothing like control. I could hear them in the timber, moving through the trees with speed and coordination that should not have been possible for anything that large. They never attacked. They never showed themselves. They simply made their presence known, and their presence was enough. We spent the night at the base. I do not think a single person slept. The sounds continued until dawn, not threatening, not aggressive, just present, constant, a reminder that they knew where we were and that they were choosing not to act. That distinction, the difference between could and chose not to. That is the most important thing I learned that night. October 15th. The weather cleared enough for extraction. As we loaded equipment, something pulled me to the tree line. I walked to the edge of the perimeter alone. I stood there and looked into the forest, and she was there, 40 feet away, standing between 2 massive cedar trunks, half hidden in shadow. The mother, still favoring her left side, the wound visible, but standing, alive. And behind her, peering around her leg, the juvenile, eyes enormous, curious, completely unafraid. She held my gaze for approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds that contained more truth than any conversation I have ever had with another human being. She was thanking me, not in words, not with a gesture, with the deliberate act of showing herself, of letting me see that she and her child had survived, of standing in the open when every instinct should have driven her deeper into the timber. She was telling me that what I did on that rim mattered, that my choice had been seen and understood. Then she placed one massive hand on the juvenile's back, and they walked into the forest together. Torres came to get me. He saw my face. He did not say a word. The price came swiftly. I was pulled from the unit that same day, transported to Madigan Army Medical Center, evaluated by 3 psychiatrists over 2 weeks, 3 different doctors in 3 different rooms asking me the same questions in different ways. Do you understand what happened in the field, Staff Sergeant? I understood perfectly. That was the problem. Mercer's report said I had suffered a psychological episode that compromised operational effectiveness. The official diagnosis was acute stress reaction with possible PTSD-related dissociation. Words designed to explain away a man who simply refused to do something wrong. I was given a choice: accept a medical discharge with full benefits and maintain absolute silence about the operation, or face a court-martial for insubordination that would result in a dishonorable discharge, the loss of my pension, and possibly federal prosecution. The choice was not really a choice. It was a transaction, my silence for my future. I took the discharge. I signed more papers. I shook hands with men who looked relieved to see me go. I went home to Karen and Lily in November of 1995, and I was a different man, the same face, the same hands, the same voice. But inside, everything had been rearranged. I could not tell Karen what happened, not because of the non-disclosure agreements, not really, because I had seen something that changed the way I understood the world, and I did not have the language to share that with another person. How do you tell your wife that you looked into the eyes of something that should not exist and felt more connection in 12 seconds than you have felt in years of human conversation? How do you explain that you threw away your career not because you broke down, but because you stood up? I could not, so I stayed silent. And silence in a marriage is not neutral. It is corrosive. It eats through trust the way acid eats through metal, slowly at first, then all at once. I woke at 3 in the morning and stood at the window looking at the tree line behind our housing unit. I flinched when helicopters flew overhead. I drove to the Cascade foothills every weekend and sat in my truck at trailheads, staring into the forest, searching for something I could not name. Karen begged me to talk to her. I could see the fear in her eyes, not fear of me, fear of losing me to something she could not see or fight. She was right to be afraid. She was losing me, not to madness, to a truth I could not share. Karen filed for divorce in March of 1996. She took Lily to her mother's house in Oregon. I did not fight it. I sat in an empty house on an army base where I no longer served and understood that the life I had built for 41 years was over. And somewhere in the Cascades, in a rain-soaked valley that no map would ever mark correctly, a mother and her child were walking through the trees, alive, because of what I did. I used every dollar of my severance to buy 47 acres of forest in the northwest corner of Washington state, land backed by thousands of acres of undeveloped wilderness. I moved into a cabin with no phone and no television, and I began a life I never planned. But the question that mattered most was one I would not have the answer to for months. Would she remember me? Would the creature whose life I tried to save recognize the man who tried to save it? April of 1996. A footprint in the mud near a creek on the eastern edge of my property, 18 inches long. My heart rate doubled. I knelt beside it in the rain and placed my hand next to it for scale, and I felt something I had not felt since that morning at the tree line. Hope. I began leaving food, apples at first, then root vegetables, then whatever I had in surplus. The food disappeared. I set up an observation post, a lawn chair behind a blind of brush, and I waited, days, weeks, months. I was patient in a way I had never been patient before, because I understood that whatever trust might grow would happen on her terms, not mine. It took 4 months. August of 1996. Dusk. The brush on the far side of the creek parted, and she walked out. I knew her immediately. The wound on her left side had healed into a patch of lighter fur, where the hair grew in thinner, a scar that was unmistakable. She stood at the creek's edge and looked at me across 30 feet of water and everything that separated our species. And she recognized me. I am certain of it. She tilted her head to the left, a gesture I would come to know as her way of thinking something through. Then she picked up an apple from the pile I had left and ate it without taking her eyes off me. She stayed 11 minutes. I timed it. Then she disappeared into the brush. I sat there for another hour, shaking, crying, laughing, 42 years old, alone in the woods, weeping over a piece of fruit, and I had never felt more alive. The visits became regular, weekly, then every few days. She appeared at dusk, ate what I left, stood watching me from across the water. I never crossed the creek, never stood from my chair, never raised my voice above a low, even tone. I talked to her about my day, about the weather, about Karen and Lily and how much I missed them. She listened. When I spoke calmly, she relaxed. When my voice carried sadness, she tilted her head and made a soft, low sound in her throat. Acknowledgement. When I laughed, she shifted her weight and made short huffing breaths that might have been her version of the same. I named her in my mind. Ada, after my grandmother, the strongest woman I ever knew. I never spoke it aloud in those early months. Names felt like a presumption I had not earned. But what does it mean when a creature that science says cannot exist chooses to return to the same spot day after day, to stand near a man who once stood between her and a bullet? I spent years thinking about that question. The answer I arrived at is simpler than I expected. It means she knew. October of 1996. Almost exactly a year after the canyon. The juvenile appeared. It came to the creek behind Ada, staying close to her leg, those enormous dark eyes watching me, maybe 4.5 feet tall, softer, darker hair, moving with a clumsy energy that was so distinctly childlike it made my chest ache. Ada kept one hand on its shoulder the entire time. No translation needed. Over the weeks, the juvenile grew bolder, crouching at the water's edge, picking up stones, splashing at minnows, fearless the way only a child can be when a parent is close enough to make the world feel safe. I watched and thought about Lily, about the weekends I was missing, the school plays, the soccer games, the bedtime stories happening in Oregon without me. The parallel cut deep. I had lost my own child's daily life because I chose to protect this child's life. I will not say I made peace with that trade, but watching Ada's child grow gave me something that Lily's absence might otherwise have consumed entirely. Spring of 1997. Ada crossed the creek. This was a milestone I had not dared imagine. She waded through the shallows and stood on my side, 6 feet away, then 10, then close enough to touch, though I never did. Not then. The first physical contact came in the summer of 1998. 2 years after her first visit to the creek, she was standing 3 feet away. I was sitting in my chair talking about a fence post. She reached out and touched the top of my head. Her hand was enormous, twice the width of mine, thick, calloused fingers, nails dark and blunt. The touch was extraordinarily gentle. She ran her fingers over my hair the way you might touch a fabric you had never felt before. Curiosity, care, a lightness that seemed impossible given her size. I held still, my eyes filled. She made the acknowledgement sound, withdrew her hand. 4 seconds. It was the most profound physical connection I have experienced in my life. More than my daughter's birth, more than my wedding night. Because in that touch was the deliberate closing of a distance that biology and history and fear had built between us. And it was she who chose to close it. The year settled into a rhythm. Ada came 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes with the juvenile, sometimes alone. I learned her patterns, her moods. She liked blueberries more than anything else. Wary in autumn when hunters moved through the surrounding forest. Playful in spring. She brought me gifts from the forest. An unusual stone, a piece of antler, mushrooms arranged on a strip of bark. I reciprocated. Blankets when temperatures dropped. Salt, which she craved. I carved a small wooden bear and left it by the creek. The next day it was gone. In its place was a bundle of cedar fronds twisted into a shape that might have been a person. It sits on my mantel now, next to a photograph of Lily's high school graduation that I was not invited to attend. 2 objects side by side. 2 lives that defined me. One I chose, one that was taken. But what happens when the world you built in secret starts to collide with the world that does not know it exists? Summer of 2001. I was in town for supplies. 2 men at the hardware store talking about tracks on state land next to my property. Big tracks, weird tracks. One mentioned the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The other had a buddy with trail cameras. The blood drained from my face. I drove home and walked the property line. Fresh tracks on the northern boundary, heading toward state forest. That night Ada appeared, and I did something I had never done. I walked to the northern fence line, pointed beyond it, made a sharp, emphatic gesture, crossed my arms, shook my head. No, danger, do not go there. A 57-year-old man waving his arms at a 7.5-foot primate. Absurd. But Ada watched with that head tilt. The next day, no fresh tracks beyond the fence. She understood. The incident forced a reckoning. 47 acres was not enough. The surrounding forest was being logged, developed, parceled. The buffer between her world and the human world was shrinking. I started buying adjacent land, every dollar I had, loans against the property. By 2005, I owned 112 acres ringed with trail cameras, motion sensors, and warning signs. My sister Margaret drove up from Portland and told me I needed professional help. The county assessor thought I was growing marijuana. I let them all believe what they wanted. The truth was safer as madness. In 2008, Ada brought someone new, a male, nearly her height but heavier, darker fur, a scar across the bridge of his nose. He stood at the far side of the creek and looked at me with an expression that held no warmth. Pure assessment, a being deciding whether something is a threat. I sat very still, hands visible. Ada placed her hand on his arm and made the low throat sound. She was introducing me to her mate, the way you introduce a friend to a spouse. The implicit request, make an effort. I named him Samuel. He never had Ada's warmth. But trust is trust, regardless of species. It requires the same ingredients: time, consistency, the willingness to be vulnerable near something you do not fully understand. By the 8th visit, he crossed the creek. By the 12th, he sat near Ada while she stood near me. Between us existed an understanding that needed no words. I was Ada's human. He was Ada's mate. We shared her world from different positions. And that was enough. The years between 2008 and 2018 were the fullest of my life. Ada and Samuel had another child in 2010. A small, dark-haired infant carried on Ada's hip with fierce protectiveness. I saw it only twice as an infant, both times from distance, both times with Ada between me and the baby. I took no offense. A mother's caution cannot be fully overridden. By 2013, the young one was toddler-sized, occasionally visible at the creek. I left smaller portions of soft fruits. Ada would hand them to the child with a tenderness that made a 7.5-foot, 400-pound creature look as gentle as any human mother I have ever seen. I kept journals. 43 notebooks over 28 years, observations, sketches, dates, weather conditions, behavioral notes. I cataloged at least 17 distinct vocalizations that Ada used regularly, each one tied to a consistent context. The low throat sound for acknowledgement, rapid clicks for warning, a sharp rising chirp that meant she had spotted something interesting, a deep resonant hum that she made when she was content, sitting in the afternoon sun near the creek, watching her child play in the shallows, a sharp barking vocalization that meant danger, a sound I heard only twice in all my years of observation, both times when she detected unfamiliar human scent on the wind. Each time she gathered the juvenile and vanished into the deep timber within seconds. No hesitation, no second assessment. The bark meant run, and they ran. I do not claim these sounds constituted language in the way linguists define it, but they constituted communication, deliberate, sophisticated, fully capable of conveying meaning between beings who shared no common tongue. Ada and I developed our own system, built from her vocalizations and my gestures, from years of repetition and correction and patience. There were failures, many of them. Early on, I tried to communicate the concept of winter. I pointed at the sky. I wrapped my arms around myself. I pretended to shiver. Ada watched me with what I can only interpret as polite confusion. She tilted her head. She looked at the sky. She looked at me. And then she walked away. I laughed. She had survived more winters in this forest than I had years left on Earth. She did not need a human to explain cold to her. But over time, the system evolved. By 2015, I could convey basic concepts: food, danger, come, go, good, bad, and she could communicate needs: hurt, hungry, worried, safe. It was rudimentary. It was also the most honest communication I have ever experienced. Stripped of pretense, stripped of ambiguity, stripped of every layer of performance and misdirection that human language makes possible. When Ada said worried, there was no subtext, no manipulation, no hidden agenda, only the truth of what she felt, delivered without ornament. And I received it the same way. What would you give to have that kind of honesty in your life? What would you sacrifice for a relationship where words mean exactly what they mean and nothing else? I can tell you what I gave, and I can tell you it was worth every single thing I lost. Spring of 2019. The first sign that something was wrong. Ada was slower, a stiffness in her movements that I attributed initially to a hard winter. The Cascades had been brutal that year. Record snowfall, temperatures below zero for weeks. I told myself she was recovering, but as the weeks passed, the stiffness did not improve. It got worse. She ate less, rested more. She would sit by the creek and stare into the water with a stillness that was different from her usual contemplative calm. I knew the difference because I had watched her for 23 years. I knew every shade of her silence, the silence of contentment, the silence of alertness, the silence of a mother listening for her child. This was none of those. This was the silence of a body that was beginning to slow down. Fatigue that rest could not fix. Samuel knew. He stayed closer to her than usual. When she walked, he walked beside her at her pace, matching his enormous stride to hers, one massive hand hovering near her back without quite touching, ready to catch her if she stumbled, ready to steady her if she swayed. It was the most human thing I had ever seen him do, and it broke my heart. I adjusted. I left softer foods, mashed berries, cooked sweet potatoes, things that would be easy to eat and easy to digest, things that would not require the effort of chewing that had once been effortless. She ate them slowly and sometimes looked at me while she ate, and in her eyes I saw something I recognized because I felt it in my own bones every morning when I stood up from bed. She was getting old, the creature who had survived a military operation, who had raised 2 children in shrinking wilderness, who had crossed the impossible divide between her kind and mine with nothing but patience and the willingness to trust. She was aging, and unlike me, she had no doctor, no medicine, no way to fight what time was doing to her body. I was 65 years old, bad knees, medicated blood pressure, a spot on my lung the VA said needed watching. I understood what she was going through. We were growing old together, 2 beings from different worlds, sitting by a creek in the fading light, feeling our bodies begin the slow process of letting go. Is there anything more human than that? Growing old beside someone who matters, watching the seasons change in their face, knowing that time is not something either of you can stop, even when that someone is not human at all. November 3rd, 2023. The last time I saw Ada. I know the exact date because I wrote it in my journal in handwriting I can barely read. My hand was shaking too badly. Late afternoon, cold, first frost whitening the grass. She came alone. No Samuel, no young one, just her. She walked out of the brush slowly, each step deliberate. She crossed the creek without stopping. She came to me, stood in front of my chair, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body. She looked old, fur thinner, gray at the temples and along the jaw. The scar on her left side, a pale line against loosening skin. But her eyes were the same, brown, intelligent, the same eyes that had looked up at me from a canyon floor 28 years ago. Tired now, but the same. She reached out and placed her hand on my head, the way she had that first time in 1998. Her fingers moved through my hair, white now, thin, nothing like the brown thatch she had first touched 25 years before. She made the acknowledgement sound, then a sound I had never heard, quiet, almost a whisper, a single sustained note that rose slightly and then fell, like a sigh given melody. I do not know what it meant in her language. In mine, it sounded like goodbye. She held my gaze for a long time. I reached up and placed my hand on hers, the first time I had ever initiated contact. Her skin was warm, rough, alive. I said, "Thank you, Ada, for everything." She blinked, withdrew her hand, turned, walked back across the creek, into the brush. The forest closed behind her like a curtain. I have not seen her since. Over 2 years now, 26 months and counting. Samuel came to the creek once, in January of 2024. He stood on the far bank, looked at me for a long time. His expression was different than it used to be. Softer, tired. He nodded once, that single downward motion of his massive head, the same gesture he had used for years. Then he turned and left. The juvenile, who is not a juvenile anymore, has passed through on trail cameras twice, both times moving deeper into the wilderness, away from roads, away from people, away from a world that does not know they exist and would destroy them if it did. I leave food at the creek, still, every evening, apples, berries, sweet potatoes. Sometimes it is taken. Sometimes it sits there until the raccoons find it. I do not know if Ada is alive. I do not know if she is gone. The forest keeps its secrets better than any non-disclosure agreement ever could. I am 71 years old. I live on this land alone. My daughter Lily is 39. We speak twice a month. Careful conversations across a distance neither of us fully created. She brought her son to visit last summer, a boy of 7 with Karen's eyes and my stubborn chin. He asked why I lived alone in the woods. I told him it was because the woods needed someone to take care of them. He accepted it the way children accept things, completely. He does not know that 50 yards from where he played in the creek, a family of beings that science says cannot exist, lived and loved and raised their children and grew old, just like us. I am telling this now because I do not know how much time I have left. The spot on my lung has become spots, plural. The VA doctor looked at me last month with a face I have seen before. The face people wear when they have information they wish they could keep to themselves. When the numbers on the chart do not tell the story you wanted to hear. He asked me if I had family nearby. I told him I had the woods. He did not understand, but Ada would have. I am telling this because on October 14th, 1995, I made a choice. The United States Army called it a psychological break. I have spent 30 years living the consequences of that choice, and I would make it again, without hesitation, without regret. I would stand on that canyon rim in the rain and put myself between the rifles and the mother and her child. I would accept every consequence that followed. Because some orders are wrong, some secrets are worth keeping, and some connections transcend every boundary the world insists is absolute. Ada taught me that. A 7.5-foot primate with reddish-brown fur and intelligent brown eyes, and a scar on her left side, taught me more about courage and loyalty and love than 14 years in the United States Army ever did. The military taught me to follow orders. Ada taught me that the only order worth following is the one that comes from the part of you that knows, without question and without compromise, what is right. I paid the price. My career, my marriage, my daughter's childhood, my family's trust, my place in the world I was raised to inhabit, all of it, gone. In return, I received 28 years of something I do not have a word for, something that lives in the space between species and language and time, something that asks nothing of me except my presence, my patience, my willingness to sit by a creek and be still. I am an old man in the woods with a secret, and if the woods will have me a little while longer, I will keep sitting by the creek at dusk, leaving apples in the mud, watching the tree line, waiting for a hand on my head that may never come again, but that I will feel, warm, gentle, impossibly real, for every remaining day of my life.